Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Is it just me, or did anyone else get a feeling of deja vu when you were hearing the gospel reading for today? Because I'll admit it, when we first read this gospel last Thursday at the noon lectionary Bible study we have here at the church, I thought maybe I grabbed last week's lectionary insert instead by mistake, because wasn't it just last week in chapter 8 of Mark's gospel that we heard, "Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." I mean, that happened, right? I mean, it was this whole thing. If you remember, Peter heard what Jesus was saying about his suffering and death, and Peter took Jesus aside and rebuked him. Jesus, in response, rebuked Peter, telling Peter that he needed to be setting his mind on divine things. And then Jesus called the crowd, and he told them how if you want to become his follower, you have to be willing to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. I mean, I preached a whole sermon about this already, didn't I? And yet, oddly enough, today's gospel is massively similar. It's just one chapter later in Mark, and Jesus and his disciples are passing through Galilee, and Jesus is teaching them, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." We've heard this one before. And you would think that this time, particularly given the excellent sermon from last week, you would think that this time we'd all, including the disciples, understand what Jesus is talking about. But it's actually quite the opposite in the gospel reading, because Mark tells us that the disciples did not understand what Jesus was saying, and even more, that the disciples were now afraid to even ask him about it. Of course, in the disciples' defense, the last time someone tried to talk to Jesus about this, they got called Satan. So there's that. Poor Peter. But it's even worse in today's gospel, because Jesus tells them that being willing to walk a suffering path is what will make him the Messiah. He's told them this powerful truth. And this time we find out that after they heard this great sermon, that the disciples spent the rest of the time on the journey arguing with one another about which one of them was going to be the greatest. Let's be clear, the disciples get a big F for their lesson on suffering and discipleship in this gospel. So I don't know, perhaps, when you heard all the lessons for today, you thought, well, there's no way Father Jared's going to preach on that gospel, given that it's basically the same sermon he preached last week. I know he had an open house yesterday and all, but he's not that lazy. Maybe you heard the James epistle reading for today, where James says, "Resist the devil and he will flee from you." And you went, ooh, I hope he preaches on that. Sounds interesting, intriguing, tantalizing. Way more fascinating than yet another week of Jesus telling us he's going to die, and that the disciples are absolutely and completely confused by this message. And to be honest with you all, I haven't really decided even now which of the two I'm going to preach on. I'm still working that out. I just wanted to have a little talk first. I want to have a little talk because there is this really odd thing in the gospel reading for today. It's very, very strange. It's kind of like a pebble in the shoe of these texts. Near the end of the gospel reading, Jesus takes a little child and places the child among the disciples, then takes the child in his arms and says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." Now, I say this is a little odd because given the difficulty of the rest of the readings for today, this one point seems remarkably easy, right? With the rest of the readings, we're talking about resisting Satan. Jesus is trying to get the disciples to listen to him again, to no avail. We're told that being willing to suffer, to be slaves to all, is the mark of discipleship. But to illustrate his point, Jesus places a child in their midst and says, if you want to welcome Jesus, you have to learn how to welcome the child. Which Given everything else Jesus is telling us, this seems like a remarkably easy command for us to follow, right? I mean, who doesn't want to just pick up and hug some cute kid and tell them how much Jesus loves them? This is not the hardest thing you've probably ever been called to do as a Christian. What church doesn't put in their parish profile, they're really hoping their new priest will help them bring in more families with children? Every church says this. None of us are struggling with this command to welcome children in. Just a few weeks ago here at St. John's, I talked about how we needed more nursery volunteers, and a good handful of you volunteered to show up, doubling the amount of nursery volunteers we have, volunteering to come and welcome the children to come among us. Now, I should say that we're still in need of 2 or 3 more people to work with a youth group, though. Sunday afternoons from 11:30 to 12:30. Apparently, for some reason, this is somewhat less appealing than small toddlers. I don't know why that might be. But if you would be willing to help with the youth group, I promise you, they're wonderful too. Just talk to Raina about it or talk to the church office. But I'm getting distracted. Point being, welcome the child. This is kind of obvious, right? This isn't actually that hard, right? Except that you and I are hearing this call through our 21st century ears. Because in the first century, children were viewed remarkably differently than they are today. Children at that time were actually not even regarded as true persons. They were kind of not yet persons. Children in that time had no value in society until they actually successfully survived all the way to adulthood and could give something back to the family. Until that happened, they were just possessions of the father in the household. So you can see some of this in the connection Jesus himself makes in the gospel reading for today. He tells the disciples, whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. That word translated as servant in verse 35 is the Greek word diakonos. This is the word we get deacon from as the ministry of the deacon, the ministry of the diaconate. This is a potent distillation of the servant ministry to which all baptized Christians are called. Whenever we see a deacon at work in the world or in the liturgy, we see in them the symbol of the service we are called to as regular everyday Christians. But in the first century world, diakonos just meant someone who waited on tables. And the people who waited on tables in the household were the kind of the lowest of the low when it came to the servants. So, as one scholar notes, Mark's audience would have heard the word child as referring to someone like the servant who served meals to everyone else in the household, someone that was without honor, without social standing. The child, the servant who waits on tables, these are people that no one really values. No one really thinks that much about. But Jesus says that they are him. So if you really want to get to the heart of the gospel reading, you almost kind of need to stop thinking about the cute children you want to hug. Instead, imagine the scene. Imagine you are there with Jesus. And Jesus asks you, what are you talking about? What has occupied most of your attention during this past week, most of your energy? It probably wasn't arguing with someone else about whether or not you were greater than them, hopefully not. But I imagine many of us still spent a significant portion of this past week after just having heard a gospel where Jesus tells us to walk a suffering path to give everything up for love and justice in the world. I'd imagine that many of us spent a significant portion of this past week still putting a lot of energy into winning, whether it was winning the argument with the person with whom we disagree, or winning with success at work, no matter the cost, or winning by trying to look like the person or the family who has it all together. We all do like to win, even if when Jesus asks us what we focus on, we don't want to admit it. So imagine Jesus asking you what you spent most of your time on this week, most of your energy. My guess is, like me, you'd probably be just as hesitant to answer as the disciples were. And now imagine this. Imagine someone who our society simply does not value as worthwhile in and of themselves. Someone who is seen as contributing very little or absolutely nothing. It's probably not children anymore, thankfully, but we still have people like that in society. Maybe it's the refugee who has nothing to bring us except for their own desire from safety, at least at first. Maybe it's a homeless person with mental illness who we tend to see as someone primarily to take care of instead of someone with inherent value and dignity, with something to teach us. Maybe it's the prisoner incarcerated because of some horrible mistake and who somehow our society believes is therefore forfeited any value to us. And so we warehouse them out of sight, out of mind. Imagine the person our society doesn't value. Imagine the person that you terribly don't value very much. Jesus takes that person, places that person in front of you and says, "This is me. This is who you are called to serve if you want to follow me. This is what should be occupying your conversations and your time and your energy. If you love Jesus, if you want to follow Jesus, then Jesus wants to know how much energy you put into reaching out to those no one else values. If you really want to follow Jesus, then Jesus wants to know how much energy you put into reaching out to those you don't value. Because if we're honest, we all have people we don't value as much as others. And they are Jesus. But I have to say, I'm still a little caught up in this reading from James, and I can't seem to let it go for some reason. You see, I used to think that resisting the devil, that this was all about spiritual warfare, praying against the evil powers of this world. This is what I thought when I was a young evangelical boy, terribly anxious about all of this stuff. And that is still a part of resisting the devil. But that's not the part James is talking about, because I used to think that until I actually read the epistle of James. Because in that epistle, James tells us precisely how you and I should resist the devil, should resist evil. We should resist the devil, James says, right in the reading for today, by walking away from the conflicts and disputes that occupy entirely too much of our time, conflicts and disputes that are far more often about our being right than they are actually about God's love and justice. Let's all be honest with each other. Instead, James told us a few weeks ago in the epistle that real religion is not about winning those conflicts and disputes. But James said real religion, religion that is pure and undefiled before God, is rather simple, and it's not about winning. Rather, James said it's to care for the orphans and widows in their distress, and keep yourself unstained from all the fighting and anger in this world. And it's so odd, because today, just like Jesus, it almost feels like James hears you and I fighting so often during the week in our lives with others. James, like Jesus, hears you and I trying so hard to win at this life. And James tells us, show by your good life that your works are being done with gentleness, born of wisdom. Ask yourself if this is what reflects your life. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. Because James promises you that a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace not for those who win, but for those who make peace. Peace in that beautiful shalom sense of the Hebrew world, peace in which all things are finally united with one another, peace in which no one is ever cast aside as being unvalued. So maybe let's all just try to stop. Let's stop trying to win. Start instead trying to be one of those who makes peace in this world. Stop trying to win for yourself, and instead start asking yourself who it is that God is calling you to welcome.